With great power comes great responsibility.
Compromise where you can. Where you can't, don't. Even if everyone is telling you that something wrong is something right, even if the whole world is telling you to move, it is your duty to plant yourself like a tree, look them in the eye and say no. You move.
Never step onto the battlefield of ideas unprepared. Before you enter the fray, you need a plan. And there's no better place to get one than right here on Tactics with host Caleb Colquitt. The Situation Room goes live now on News Radio 1440.
Good evening, everybody. Happy Halloween and welcome to Tactics. I'm your host, Caleb Colquitt, as always, right here on News Radio 1440. We appreciate you being with us, whether you're joining us on YouTube Live, on Facebook Live, on Twitter, Twitch, or Periscope, or however else you choose to join us. You may be joining us on the terrestrial signal. We certainly appreciate you making us a part of your day right here on Tactics, where speech isn't violence, tolerance isn't love, and disagreement isn't hate. Well, thank you so much for being with us here on our Halloween special. We appreciate you joining us at this late hour. We do the special late at night in honor of Halloween. But as you can see, my costume this year is Deathstroke. I've actually got the great prison background, which Jessica Dawson, our graphic designer, cooked up for us. We even have the special Tactics logo here with the Halloween theme. So thank you so much for being with us. As you can tell, I'm a big fan of Halloween. It's something that I've always really liked. However, this year my costume is just a little bit obtrusive. I've actually done shows in costumes before, but considering this one covers pretty much my entire face, I realized that would make it very difficult to do this broadcast, and so because of that, I am going to go ahead and just take the mask off. I wanted you guys to see the whole thing to get the full effect, but, you know, it's not practical, so I am going to be removing the Deathstroke mask. So thank you guys so much for being with us. I figured as a compromise, and I thought that this would be appropriate, I could at the very least be Wade Wilson with the mask off. So, I mean, I guess technically he's still Deathstroke even when his mask is off, but there we go. Now, the only thing that's going to be interesting about this is whether or not I can actually see my microphone over there. You know, blinding yourself in one eye, it really does make it a little bit more difficult when your mic is right out there on this side of you. But, you know, I've got the camera in front of me, so I should be able to monitor it. Anyway, thank you so much for being with us, and we do try to do little things like this to make the show more interesting. We're always trying to entertain as well as inform, and there is a lot of news of the day to get to, and of course we're going to try to do the best that we can to give you all the latest breaking local news to try to get you over the weekend. Now, here's a really interesting one. Governor Ivey has signed into law a chemical castration bill. Now, for those of you that have been paying attention to state news and have been paying attention to this program and our coverage of it, this is not something that's all that new to you. This is not something that you've not heard of before. So a House bill actually passed a while back, and there were some procedural things, but eventually it did make its way to the governor's desk, and the governor has now officially signed that bill. So we're just looking into some of the implications of that. There's a couple things that you need to understand about the inner workings and the logistics about this bill. Frankly, I am going to say some things that you may, misinterpret if you didn't know me and didn't know sort of my stances on stuff like this. First of all, I can say this unequivocally with no reservation, with no qualification. I have no problem with castrating a sex offender for somebody that has been accused of rape of anybody, much less a child, and that's who this bill would specifically target. So if I do seem critical of the bill, I want you to understand it's not because I disagree with the bill in principle. I'm just trying to look at the advantages and disadvantages like we do with anything else, but I know with matters that tend to be the sensitive people sometimes maybe not necessarily forget that, but they take criticism of it the wrong way. I have no problem with sex offenders being castrated or dismembered completely, not even chemical castration. I'm talking about actual dismemberment. And because rape is such a heinous crime, I think that you could make a compelling case for the death penalty to be evoked, even absent a murder. Because obviously, if there's like a rape and then a murder, people tend to be a little bit more open to the death penalty. I think you can make a moral and a legal case for rape being a worse crime than murder. I think that that's actually possible, and because of that, I don't think that the death penalty should be something that is out of the realm of possibility. So, when it comes to that, at least from my part, it's not because I disagree with the idea of castration of somebody that has been convicted of these offenses. It's just that the bill itself does, I think, have some problems. So, first of all, Governor Ivey does actually go ahead and sign this into law. And here's the thing: I actually agree with her. If you put this bill on Governor Caleb Colquitt's desk, I probably sign it too. I don't think that she made the wrong call here, but you need to understand that what this bill does is it only applies to people that rape children under the age of 13, and even then it only affects them if they are going to go on try to apply for and get parole. So if a convict in this particular situation gets parole, they have to partake of these chemicals in order to chemically castrate them before they can enter back into society on parole, which leaves open a number of questions, chiefest among them: how the heck is a guy that raped a 13-year-old getting parole in the first place? That, to me, is the biggest problem here. Because if you're somebody that went out, man or woman, I, of course, used a man, but and that is more common, but I'm talking about just in general. You rape a 13-year-old, I really don't care who you are, how good a behavior you may have in prison. That person doesn't need to be walking around anymore. And again, I'm not even somebody that would oppose the death penalty for something like that, but considering this bill only affects somebody that has raped someone under the age of 13, I'm just kind of sitting here wondering, why would that guy even be considered for parole? Considering what he's done here, I just don't understand that guy. You bury that guy under the jail, so far as I'm concerned. I have absolutely no sympathy for this guy whatsoever who has done something like this, or woman in that case. Man, woman, doesn't matter to me. If they've been raping children under the age of 13, that person does not need to be loose in society under any circumstances, so far as I'm concerned. But the reason for that, I think that this is going to be something that is largely ineffective, that's not going to affect many people, because one of two things is happening here. Either we do have people that have raped 13-year-olds that are getting out on parole, and this is going to be a law that actually does affect them, or, and I hope this is the case, we do not have people that have raped 13-year-olds that are getting out for parole, and this law is going to be pretty much entirely symbolic. That yes, it's going to be officially on the books, and yes, if this situation ever were to arise, you would certainly have that person have to undergo this chemical castration process, but ultimately, the question really does boil down to, if that is the case, I think that this is what we're looking at as a red meat bill. In other words, Governor Ivey and the other Republicans in the House and Senate in the state of Alabama basically passed this thing, wrote it up, and passed it to try to gain political points, knowing that it's probably not ever going to affect anybody. Because somebody that has raped a 13-year-old is not going to be out for parole. I hope that's the case. It could be the first scenario. But I think what is more likely going on here is that you have them knowing that this is never actually going to take effect, but they get credit for being tough on crime and tough on specifically rapists and sex offenders without having to pass anything that actually affects anybody's life. Now, I don't know if that actually is their motivation. I don't know if that was what they were thinking, or in Governor Ivey's case, I imagine she just saw this thing put on her desk and said, "Yep, I think that's a good idea." I don't know that she was thinking that far into it, because if that thing shows up on your desk as governor, you probably do exactly the same thing. Even if Governor Ivey takes the stance that I do, I don't know if she does or not. I have no reason to believe she does. I don't know about her stances on these kind of things. But just looking at it this way, even if Governor Ivey happens to be more along the lines that I am, that somebody that if you're a rapist or a sex offender, I don't have a problem with that. Dismemberment actually being a punishment for that, straight up just lopping off the boys if you're convicted of that crime. So because of that, I think maybe what's happening here is that I don't want to attribute any one politician's motive to that, because they may have just seen a bill that they like, they wish were stronger, but they liked this bill and thought it was a step in the right direction, so voted for it. Because that's exactly where I would be if I were asked to vote on this bill up or down. I would say, yeah, I like it. I think it doesn't go nearly far enough, but I'm going to vote for it because I believe it to be preferable to what we have now, even though this is probably not really going to affect any criminals in the criminal justice system as it stands. That to me is a fairly likely scenario. But regardless of this, I do hope that just the awareness that chemical castration could be a fate that you face if you're messing with a kid under the age of 13, I would hope that would act as a deterrent to a lot of these guys. I have no idea if they are. There has been some research to suggest that it is something that keeps repeat offenders. There's really not any evidence for it acting as a effective deterrent. I hope that it does. I can't say one way or the other whether it does or not. But along those same lines, speaking of child rape, and I know that that's a horrible transition because you never want to be talking about that, or have to talk about it in the news. But speaking of pedophilia and raping children, the doctor that was hired by serial child rapist and facilitator of said child rapes, Jeffrey Epstein, well, it turns out that Jeffrey Epstein's brother hired one of the world's leading physicians to observe his brother's body and give him a reading on this, which, I mean, frankly makes sense because there's already a level of suspicion there. And on top of that, this is a person that has a pretty significant amount of money. So this is coming from the Miami Herald and some of the reporting going on down there. I got to give them credit. The journalists that are doing this, really good. And they're talking to this expert. This is a guy, Dr. Michael Baden, who, according to the Miami Herald, is, quote, one of the world's leading forensic pathologists, viewed Jeffrey Epstein's body and was present at the autopsy. So this is a person that was there at the autopsy. He's kind of been there. He's been sort of in that area. He was on hire from the Epstein family to oversee all of this. And he's somebody that isn't just coming in late to the show and starting to try to pick up clues long after the fact. He's been there throughout this entire process. So I think that that does lend him a certain level of credibility that normally would not be there with a personal physician charged with doing an autopsy. Normally, in these situations, that is something that occurs much later. This is somebody who was contemporaneously with Epstein and his remains the entire time. And one of the interesting things that he brought up in this analysis is that there were fractures on both the right and left sides of Jeffrey Epstein's larynx. And so he starts commenting on the fractures and the way that he observed them. And this was the quote that he uttered about the condition of Epstein's body. Quote, those fractures are extremely unusual in suicidal hangings and could occur much more commonly in homicidal strangulation, said Dr. Braden, who added that there were hemorrhages in Epstein's eyes that are also more common in strangulation than in hangings. So, one of the things that's important to really zero in on when you're looking at that statement is that this is inconclusive, but these kinds of fractures, as well as the hemorrhaging in the eyes, those things do not typically happen with suicides. They are far more common when someone else is strangling the person. Now, is that conclusive? Absolutely not. Is that smoking gun? No. But when you think about that, and you also couple it with all the cameras just having to go off at exactly the right amount of time, the guards that were supposed to check on him every 15 minutes just somehow all fell asleep at the same time and weren't there for about 2 hours. The fact that somehow he goes right off suicide watch right before the suicide happens, the fact that he was supposed to be given paper sheets and somehow wound up with cloth sheets. I mean, the list just goes on and on and on of the things that the weird coincidences that just happen to all happen at exactly the same time that coincided with Epstein's suicide. And I know that a lot of people, especially because I'm a political commentator, the way that their mind works and the first thing that it goes to is, well, the Clintons. Here's the thing. I don't think that the Clintons did it for a couple of reasons. First of all, because it's very high profile and people were kind of expecting them to, which is the reason that it would have been smarter for them to lay off. And the second reason is because the Clintons do not wield nearly as much power and influence as they once did. And I'm not just talking about because it's a step down from the White House. I'm talking about they don't have the money and power and prestige that they did even just a couple of years ago after the failing of the election. And you have to remember that Jeffrey Epstein is a guy that had dirt on a lot of very famous rich people. And we're talking about people everywhere from the royal family to the mob. And so I think it's far more likely that there's, 40, 50 other people other than the Clintons that want him dead, that they know that his testimony or his evidence would absolutely destroy their life if it ever got leaked out. You can't tell me there's at least one of those people that decides that it would be better to cut their losses literally and cut their losses off with killing Jeffrey Epstein. I'm not saying I know for sure that the Clintons weren't involved. I'm just saying that looking at the evidence that we have now and looking at the most likely outcome, it is most plausible that if Jeffrey Epstein did not actually commit suicide, and I don't believe that he did personally, I don't have evidence to prove it, of course, I think it's far more likely that another person with an awful lot of power took him down, not the Clintons, just based on the scenario that I'm seeing. That to me seems the most likely conclusion to reach. And one other thing before we move just into national news, of course, the Epstein was national as well, but it kind of connected to our local story. One more local story that I wanted to get to before we go on to a break. Will Dismukes. For those of you who don't know, Will Dismukes is the representative in the House, the State House of Alabama, District 88, my district actually. Voted for him in the last election. He's been a friend of the program, been on, I think, 3 times. I think he's been on the program 3 times now. And so he's somebody that I consider a friend of the program. He's somebody that I consider a friend personally. Really good guy. He has actually announced that he will not be seeking the District 2 House seat to go to Washington, D.C. to represent the 2nd District of Alabama. Now, he announced this earlier today, and basically he said that he just did not have the money and the support to continue this campaign. Qualification, I believe, is November 4th. And so he was probably nearing that deadline and just realized, guys, there's no way that we're going to make it past the finish line. We've got too much ground to make up. And because of that, it makes more sense to just go ahead and quit now as opposed to wasting our time and not being able to qualify. And there may have been at least a hint of, you know what, I want to leave this race on my terms. And that's okay, and that's perfectly understandable. So I've actually talked to Will not too long ago. And granted, it was before he announced this. he said he was planning on doing an interview with me, if not this week, the next week. Now, that was probably when he was still going to stay in the race. I don't know if he'll want to do the interview now or not, but I'm going to try to talk to him and see what happened. Because here's the thing. This guy is really well liked in District 88, and he's somebody that does a really good job. I've been thoroughly impressed with him, and I told him multiple times on the air. You guys heard me if you were listening to those interviews. You can go and look them up on SoundCloud right now. I told him, I was skeptical of having a guy that young. This is a guy that's younger than me. I was skeptical of having a guy that young go to the state house because I've seen guys that have families and are much more mature than him, not through any fault of Will's, just because, they have more life experience. And people that are very religious, active in their church, don't seem to have a lot of moral failings, go to Montgomery and just get drowned in that muck in the swamp, and not only get involved with messing with a whole bunch of women and all kinds of other things, all kinds of other temptations that come in the city of Montgomery, and being an elected official that wields a significant amount of power in the state, I've seen it ruin people. And I've also seen a lot of young idealistic politicians talk about low taxes, small government, and then they get into the state house or they get into the state senate, and that all goes out the window. They have somebody playing a bug in there. Look, if you really want to be on these important committees, if you really want to be somebody that makes a difference, if you really want to be somebody that is taken seriously by their colleagues, you just have to compromise a little bit here. You just have to not be so small government. You just have to not be that conservative. You just have to be okay with some of these new taxes. And it doesn't take long, within a year or two, usually before their term is even halfway up, they've already come into the swamp. They're already a member of the club. And they can go out and campaign on God and guns and small government, and then they get in the state house and they do the exact opposite. They grow government, they grow government, they grow government, and then they grow government some more. And after they've grown government, they realize we don't have the money to pay for it, so we're also going to have to increase taxes. Normally, that's what happens. That is the normal process, the normal flow of events when it comes to new members of the House and Senate. And I'm going to give Will a massive compliment here. He didn't do that. Based on absolutely everything that I saw, based on his voting record, based on the person that he continues to be, he campaigned on, you know what, I'm not going to raise taxes, I believe in small government, and dang it, he did it. He voted against the gas tax, has one of the most conservative voting records in the House, and this is a guy that's younger than me. That's worthy of praise and commendation. And I got to hand it to him. I mean, I was a little nervous at first, but I do believe in what the scripture says, don't despise someone just because of their youth. Actually, that was Paul saying to Timothy, let no man despise you because of your youth. I don't want to misquote there. But the point is, there is a biblical principle that just because somebody is young does not mean that you write them off. And it's a very good thing. It's a good rule to have. A lot of people have to remember to do that when they listen to me. But when it comes to Will, he showed more spine, more backbone, and more conservative principles than a lot of his much older Republican colleagues. And I really do hate that he's getting out of this race because I think he would have been a dang good representative. And I would have loved to have seen him up there. But here's the thing. He's a young guy, stroke survivor, tough as nails. This guy has a bright future. Now, granted, just like every other politician, it's going to be difficult for him to stay on that conservative path. But if he can, and he stays on the trajectory that he's at now, he's already a state representative in the House in his 20s. If he stays on that trajectory, if he stays interested, he stays relevant to the people and actually listening to them, listening to their concerns, because this is a guy that's very well liked in District 88. And I'll say this, he worked his butt off pounding the pavement to get to all the voters to make sure he won that election, because it wasn't because he was able to outspend his opponent. It wasn't because he just had all these friends in high places. He did eventually secure some high-level endorsements and a few donations, but I mean, that was after months and months of campaigning and a lot of hard work, and he deserved every bit of it. So I just really commend him, and if he wants to have a future in politics, I think that he certainly can. I think that he is well primed to do so. And I'll say this. I know that you can't do a what-if scenario every single time something happens, but I do think that it helps us to do some self-reflection and think about this. I think it may actually be something that God had intended for Will all along to go through something like this. And the reason that I say that is DC, because you just heard my description of what normally happens to people in the House and the Senate. That's in the Alabama House and the Alabama Senate in Montgomery. And sure, the stakes are high, but let's be honest, they ain't anywhere near as high as they are in DC. And if that kind of stuff happens in Montgomery, it's tenfold in DC. And maybe what's happening is the Lord is strengthening Will up to do that later. I don't know. I have no idea what the Lord has in store for Will Dismukes. But maybe that is what's going on. And I really do pray that if he is going to be involved sometime at the federal level, that he uses this time as a state representative to sort of strengthen himself and to get a little more experience under his belt. And I do think that eventually what will happen is he'll emerge more ready to take on that task in Washington, D.C. to represent Alabama in some capacity. You know, I think a lot about this with what happened with Matt Bevin. You may remember that Matt Bevin of Kentucky tried to unseat Mitch McConnell. Great guy, conservative, actually believed in what he said, held on to his conservative principles of small government, lower taxes, that kind of thing, and did the best that he could to unseat McConnell and wound up losing. Then he comes back just a few years later and winds up governor of the great state of Kentucky. Well, technically a commonwealth, because Kentucky's a commonwealth, but you know what I'm saying. He really wanted to win that Senate, I assure you. He wanted to win that Senate seat. But the Lord had other plans for him. And I think that the people of Kentucky would tell you that they're better off because Matt Bevin is where he is now as opposed to in the Senate. A whole lot of those people, including some of my relatives, would a lot rather had him than Mitch McConnell. But the point is, Bevin wound up where he needed to be. And I think that's something that if you're a Christian and you're a believer, you believe that the Lord kind of works out to our advantage as well. After all, you have to kind of go back to the Romans 8:28 philosophy where God, works everything out for the good of those who love him. So what we're going to do is we're going to take a quick break here and we'll be back in just a moment.
Hey, where you going? Champ? Slugger? Hey, cowboy. Where you going? Where you going?
I'm going out!
Hey y'all, I am on I-85 heading south, coming back from the loveliest village on the plains back to Montgomery. And part of the reason that I wanted to talk about this is because I just got back from Auburn judging a parliamentary procedure contest. One of the things that it teaches young people is the art of debate. And because I was judging that and because I was thoroughly impressed with a lot of the kids that I saw today, it really made me appreciate it, made me think about what an integral part of being able to debate a topic is to a person's education. And it's the really intelligent young people that are able to engage in this contest. It's a very difficult contest. You don't even know what the subject is going to be until 1 minute before the contest starts. And so you have about 60 seconds to, in your mind, come up with 4 debates, whether this topic is a good idea or a bad idea, and you have to be able to think on your feet, and you have to be able to debate back and forth with your teammates. It's an incredibly difficult contest, even though, as a general rule, there aren't a lot of people that go through this contest that continue to use the rules of parliamentary procedure later in life. And I'm sure some do with their local churches or small organizations like that that actually use Robert's Rules of Order. Really what the contest teaches is the art of debate. You have to be able to think on your feet. You have to be able to very quickly come up with compelling arguments and to form your ideas and your thoughts about a topic into a coherent piece of thought and convey that to other people in such a way that it convinces them to side with you. And I was thinking about this, and this is a contest that you can't participate in until you get to at least the 9th grade. And it really made me sit down and think about how criminal it is that we don't teach our students debate much earlier. But there was a time where a staple of Western thought, that if you were an educated person in the West, you were started on debate at a very early age. In fact, it was not at all uncommon for somebody to be well-versed in the art of rhetoric, well-versed in the art of persuasive speech. From a very early age, it was one of the very first things that they taught. In ancient Greece, for example, going all the way back to the birth of Western civilization, they started you on that when you were about 5. They started you on geometry of all things and rhetoric. And the reason for that, the rationale for that, was that it was important because it taught you how to think critically. In other words, if you were involved in rhetoric and you had to learn how to put your thoughts together that quickly and you had to challenge ideas and sometimes even take the opposite side of the position that you actually held on an issue, it taught you those really critical thinking skills. And because of that, the rest of your education was easier. Because nothing teaches you a subject like having to defend it against attack, or the opposite, having to attack it and finding the places where the thinking is flawed or where the ideology needs some improvement. And so because of this, this was a staple of Western civilization really up until about 100 years ago. And it's part of the reason that the education system worked so well for so long. For the longest time, our students had to not only learn material, but had to stand up and defend it, or stand up and be critical of it. And that really helped them understand and absorb the material. And furthermore, because they started out with that first and developed their critical thinking skills, the rest of their education was more robust because they had those critical thinking skills and those problem-solving skills to begin with. So it made a real difference in our education system, and it's something that I believe is sorely lacking, something that we need to bring back. And another bit of social commentary on this is that when it comes to the stereotypical characteristics of some people in my generation and the generation after it, Generation Z, what do you typically think about? They have a hard time taking criticism. They don't like hearing ideas that are not shared by them. There are things that they say is actually violence or harmful to their health to hear ideas that they disagree with. Well, the reason that that wasn't the case for the longest part of Western civilization is because we took on the idea that you ought to have to defend your own ideas, that ideas ought to be observed critically, and that you should have to go through and test whether or not something was true or not. That's really not the way education works now. They give you facts that they say are true and then expect you to just sort of regurgitate them on the test. That's not an education. That's memorization. And there's nothing wrong with memorization. Memorization is great. I'm an advocate of it. But it's not the same as having to defend your ideas.
And welcome back, everybody. Thank you so much for being with us through the break. Now, we do have a couple of other stories that I wanted to get to before we head out for the weekend. First of all, this is kind of several tiny stories within a story. The Squad is at it again. So the Squad, of course, consisting of Larry, Curly, Moe, and then that other girl that nobody can remember her name. No, the Squad is back, and they are at it again. They have all wound up in a news story this week. So we're going to go with a couple of clips. And frankly, I just find these incredibly entertaining, which is part of the reason that we're going to go over them. Here's a clip from Rashida Tlaib, who apparently she has some different ideas about how Congress should be run. We'll go ahead and take a listen there.
I go into these classrooms and, the second and third grade classrooms to read, Grace for President. And at the end, I try to explain what my job is. And before I begin, I just ask, how many of you all have asthma? I have a hard time breathing, and a third of the class will raise their hand. And I tell them, my job is to protect your air so that you can breathe. And the kids are like, your eyes wide open. I said, sometimes it's really hard, right? And they said, yes. And I tell them that, we can probably get in there and try to clean the water and provide clean water, but we can't do that with air. And these second and third graders, sometimes I wish they could be in this room and make these decisions, because they know what's right, and they know they don't have any kind of political strategy behind it. They just know it's just the right thing to do. And I want to really emphasize that.
Well, that's Rashida Tlaib. Apparently, she thinks that Congress would be in better hands if there were a bunch of second or third graders running it, which, to that I would say, if we're talking about second or third graders running it as opposed to Rashida Tlaib, then, well, yeah, then I'd be in favor of it, actually. I think they'd probably do a better job than her. But there was one line in there that I really thought was hilarious, is people ask me what my job is, and I tell them, my job is to protect your air. And I just thought about that and figured I'd whip out my trusty pocket constitution. And I've got Article 1 opened up right now, the duties of Congress. Let's see, duties of Congress, uniform laws of naturalization, levy taxes, Navy and Army, provide punishment for counterfeiting coins, post offices, roads, tribunals, provide and maintain a Navy. Man. Rashida Tlaib must have a different constitution than the one I'm reading, because I don't see anything about protecting air. That is really weird. That when a bunch of kids ask a representative of Congress what her job is, it's not making law or talking about any of the things in the Constitution. Her immediate response is, I'm protecting your air. How would a member of Congress even do that anyway? The idea that Congress is the one that should be in charge of something like that is absurd for a number of reasons. First of all, that's something that the states could easily handle and, frankly, would be better equipped to handle than the federal government anyway. But the idea that Rashida Tlaib should be doing random crap like that as opposed to actually doing her job, which is described in the Constitution, read it, Rashida. It ain't that long. You can go through it and actually find out what your job is. This is a thing that you are capable of doing, I assume. Surely they've got a copy of the Constitution somewhere in D.C. I've seen a couple copies of it up there when I went there. Maybe if you did that and started focusing on that part as opposed to this other crap that you assume is part of your job but is actually nowhere in Article 1 of the Constitution, maybe then, you might actually be able to accomplish something worthwhile as opposed to the stuff that you normally do. But to the overall point of, I really just wish that there were kids that were making these decisions because they just know what's right, and they seem to be more in tune with that than adults are. You hear Democrats make statements like this all the time. All the time. You've got them saying that, well, we really just need to listen to the children, and we should take the children seriously. You heard them say this in things like Parkland, where there were a bunch of kids going around saying, hey, we should be taking people's guns away from them. You had the same thing with Greta, the whole thing that was going on with the climate change, where she just very passionately and emotionally shouts at a bunch of adults, how dare they take away her childhood or some random crap like that about climate change. The same thing where they're saying that we need to lower the voting age to 16 so that they would be able to vote. The reason that they say junk like that is because the younger you are, the more likely you are to adopt Democrat ideas. And as a personal anecdote in that, I was exactly the same way. Because when I first started college as a freshman, I was more or less a moderate Republican. I was very much a George Bush guy. I really liked John McCain. I didn't really understand conservatism or the principles underlying that. I was more of a rah-rah Republican kind of guy. Now, there were certain things about John McCain that I didn't like, and I certainly liked some of the more conservative members as well, but generally speaking, I was more of a barely center of right kind of person. I didn't really understand constitutionalism, and so because of that, that's where I landed. You go back further, do you know who I actually supported when I was really young? And I'm talking about third grade when we first started talking about civics and government. I really liked Bill Clinton. And the reason I did is because my teachers described it as, well, one of the things that Bill Clinton believes is that we should be spreading wealth around and that we should be helping out poor people. And of course, in my own naive third grader mind, I thought, well, yeah, we should definitely be doing that. I didn't really understand the nuance and the intricacies of what was going on there. And as I got older and wiser, I became more conservative, which, by the way, is something that happens demographically across all demographics. Man, woman, urban, rural. The older a person gets, they get more conservative. Now, sometimes a person starts out way, way on the left, and when they get older, becoming more conservative looks like becoming a moderate. But the point is, as people age, they tend to move in that direction because life has taught them experience and wisdom, and they understand that conservatism makes a lot more sense from a pragmatic standpoint. Now, I will say this, that's not to say that everything that children have to say, or young people in general, even young adults have to say, is always necessarily wrong. Children are idealistic, passionate, emotional, but they're also really easily duped. And because they're far more emotional and haven't learned how to temper their emotions and their impulses, they tend to make rash decisions that get them in trouble. That's why our judicial system is different for juveniles as opposed to adults. We recognize that. We understand that. We understand that their brain hasn't fully developed, that their decision making is not always going to be great because that part of their personality hasn't solidified yet. And because of that, we judge them differently. But here's the thing. If you're going to be somebody that says to me, well, a 16-year-old ought to be able to vote. Well, in my mind, what that means is if you want to go down that route, then you also have to allow 16-year-olds to be able to enlist in the army, fight for this country, and you also have to judge a 16-year-old as though he is an adult in every situation. I hate these stupid half-measure things that we try to do with adulthood and prolonged adolescence. Either a person is a man or a woman, or they are a child. There is no in between. And we shouldn't do this weird slow roll thing where we gradually make somebody a full citizen. I'm somebody that even opposes the 21-year-old law when it comes to drinking. Look, I'm not a person that likes drinking. I've never had a drop of alcohol in my entire life. And if anyone were to ask me my stance on it, I would say, well, I don't think it's necessarily sinful, even though drunkenness is sinful. But drinking is incredibly stupid. That is my stance on it. But you're telling me that somebody has the maturity to go out and go to war and make life and death decisions literally every day, depending on what they're doing over there. And they also have the maturity to vote and decide who should be running this country, who should be in control of the levers of power, but they shouldn't be able to make the decision of whether or not they want to consume alcohol or cigarettes. I would be the person that would say to that person, look, I think you're an idiot if you pick up either one of those habits, but it should still be that person's choice to make if they're going to be a full citizen. And Democrats are in this constant state of trying to slow roll adulthood and slow roll these responsibilities because they know that it nets them votes. They want to say to these people, you know what, you're 16-year-old, sure, you should be deciding who should be the leader of the free world. You should have a say in that. But also, you're not mature enough to be off of your parents' insurance until you're 27 years old. That's insane. Either a person is a man and responsible for himself or he is not. There is no halfway point here. And there shouldn't be in the eyes of the law. But the truth is, in many ways, Rashida Tlaib's wish has already come true. Because we do have an awful lot of people that do act like children in the House of Representatives. And there is perhaps no better or more fitting example than her bosom buddy, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, and we're going to see why here in just a second.
Mr. Chairman, may I make a comment? Yes. I would like to do my job, and I try not to get out of my job at every opportunity. So given the fact that we have convened former governor of California and Senator Whitehouse here, we're here to talk about the very pressing issue of cutting our carbon emissions and saving our planet, and we have an entire political party that is trying to get out of their job, adjourn this hearing, and I just want to know what the reason for such a disrespect of our process would potentially be. Do we have a reason for why this hearing is trying to be adjourned, or, do we have just like a cocktail party?
Yes, I have one. I have a really easy one. The oil industry is the second largest industry in my state. My constituents expect me to be here. We are running an impeachment hearing down in the basement of the Capitol
is this
right
about
now.
The oil industry, or
no, it's about the economy of the state of North Dakota and my constituents.
And North Dakota. This isn't
I
about
want to
California.
participate in this hearing, but I feel the need to be in the SCIF because we're only one of 3 committees that's allowed to be in the room. I can do a lot of things. I can't be 2 places at once. I'm completely comfortable having this hearing. I just prefer to have it at a time when I could participate in it.
This was a conversation that was brought up, and this could not have been brought up before we convened the senator and the governor. We're doing this when they're here.
We've expressed this last week about having 2 things going on at the same time. It's not like we haven't talked about this, but you guys continue to do hearings at the same time there are depositions going on. As the gentleman from North Dakota said, we can't be 2 places at once. You talk about wanting to do your job. Yeah. There's no way to do that when you have to be 2 places at once.
And just to be clear, there was exactly 1 Democrat in the room when this started.
And now that's a takedown. I love the thing that he told off on. By the way, when this hearing started, there was 1 Democrat in the room. So AOC just absolutely puts her foot in her mouth, this time over a procedural thing. And there's a couple things that I want to take away from it. You'd think after AOC, she's humiliated herself so many times during these committee meetings or on the floor of the House. You would think at some point she would learn some restraint and to just be a little bit more cautious in her language or what she accuses people of. But no, she has 2 switches, off and turbo, and that's all she can do. She is either vicious and attacks people and attacks them personally and their motives, or she's doing nothing. That's the only 2 options that she has. And here she is in this committee accusing the Republicans and her colleagues there on the floor, saying that, well, they're just trying to get out of doing their job. I don't know if she's suggesting that because either they're lazy or they're just uncomfortable having the conversation. But the Republican representatives there are having none of that because they're saying, okay, For one, there was only one Democrat in the room when this started. So if you want to point fingers at people not wanting to do their job, maybe you should point at the Democrats who weren't here on time and didn't get it started here on time. And she's just asking, well, like, could I, like, get a reason for why we're, like, trying to adjourn here and why the Republicans want to adjourn? Well, yeah, we're supposed to be in the basement right now having a completely different hearing. We can't be in two places at once. And then he starts talking about how important this is, emphasizing that, no, I actually do want to have this conversation. I actually do want to be here because the oil industry is incredibly important to my state of North Dakota. I have a vested interest in doing this. I just have to be somewhere else. And then she pivots to, well, like, is this like about the oil industries and stuff? No, I want to be here. I'm using that as emphasis for why I think it's important for me to do so, but I can't be in two places at one time. And then I think she starts just kind of realizing that that was a reasonable thing to request, and then she tries to pivot yet again to, we couldn't have, like, brought this, like, up before? We did. We brought it up last week that we were going to have a schedule conflict. So AOC, if you ever want to know why, and you've heard me say this 1,000 times when I'm talking about debating or having a discussion with someone with whom you disagree, this is why you don't assume motive. Because sometimes you may assume motive, and it may make perfect sense in your own mind. And I'm sure in AOC's mind, it made perfect sense that these are a bunch of evil, heartless Republicans that hate the planet and want to destroy it. But because of that, they really don't want to have this conversation, and they're trying to get out of doing their job. You see, she assumed that the people that she was talking about, that their intentions were evil and lazy. And that's the reason that making these attacks made perfect sense within her own mind, twisted as it may be. And what these representatives had to come back with is, no, we actually do have a legitimate reason for doing this, and it's not that we just don't want to be here or don't want to do our jobs. It's that we're trying to do our jobs, and it's made impossible by the fact that we're on two committees that are meeting at the same time. That's why you don't assume motive, because there's always the chance that someone has a perfectly rational motive that you haven't thought of yet. And then when they explain it, you look like the moron, or you look like the person that's actually heartless. That happens a lot. In fact, there was a similar incident. This is just, I'm going to use this as an illustration because it happens to be Halloween. I was having a conversation about Halloween not too long ago, and I made mention of a couple of years ago, I was bald, and I wanted to do go to a Halloween party, and I was planning on going as Professor Xavier, and I was going to borrow one of the wheelchairs from church and just wear a suit as a bald guy and be Professor Xavier, which I thought was hilarious. But I said I wasn't able to go because I was sick. And the girl meant absolutely no harm, and I understood that at the time, and I understand it now, that nothing's changed. She meant absolutely no harm. She didn't know the situation. She didn't know what I meant when I said that I was sick and couldn't go. The reason that I couldn't go is because I had just had a full dose of chemo and was not feeling up to it on Halloween night to go out to the Halloween party. And so what she said was, and I love freaking people out like this, she said, "Oh, you were sick." And I was like, "Yeah, I had cancer." You should have seen the reaction on her face. It's like, "Oh, I'm so sorry. I didn't know." I was like, "Yeah, I was just messing with you. Like, it's really not a big deal." But watching the fact that she thought she had struck a nerve, she had assumed motive, and then it turned out that I had a perfectly logical reason for not being present at that Halloween party that she was, at the time, unaware of. And so that's what really made it funny. The exact same thing just happened here on the floor of this committee meeting in the House of Representatives, is that there was a motive that AOC didn't consider. She just assumed the absolute worst and decided to go fangs forward after these Republicans without realizing that actually the reason that they didn't do this is because they wanted to do their jobs. And truly, that is the definition of prejudice. She judged them before she knew what their motives were. And that brings me finally to Ilhan Omar, who voted present on a bill condemning the Armenian genocide. Now, this is not something that's surprising to anybody that's been paying attention to Ilhan Omar for any amount of time. She always sides with the Muslims, regardless of how indefensible their stance is on every single issue, be it modern or historical. And this is a person that actively despises Jews and isn't real fond of Christians either. So the fact that she sided with the Muslim nation, the Ottoman Empire, modern day Turkey, as opposed to, sided with them instead of the Christians that were being persecuted and slaughtered in the Armenian genocide, that's really not something that should come as a surprise to anyone. The only people that continue to deny the Armenian genocide is the Turkish government. Everybody else, they assume that this happened. They've talked about it. The Turkish government is the only one that denies it to this day. To this day, they've removed it from all their records. They swear it never happened, despite the mountains of evidence to the contrary. But Omar is always more than happy to repeat whatever Muslim propaganda comes her way. And when it comes to Turkey, she's no different, because the Turks basically assure everybody that no, this was a fabrication. They're basically Holocaust deniers, but it's a whole country of them. And they say that this never happened. It did. There's record after record after record of it. They say it didn't because it makes them look bad. And because that is a piece of Muslim propaganda, Ilhan Omar is all too willing to parrot it. So she voted present in this resolution to condemn the Armenian genocide, and this was her rationale. We'll go ahead and go here. This is the official statement from Ilhan Omar's people. I believe accountability for human rights violations, especially ethnic cleansing and genocide, is paramount, but accountability and recognition of genocide should not be used as a cudgel in a political fight. It should be done based on academic consensus outside the push and pull of geopolitics. A true acknowledgement of historical crimes against humanity must include both heinous genocides in the 20th century, along with earlier mass slaughters like the transatlantic slave trade and Native American genocide, which took the lives of hundreds of millions of indigenous people in this country. For this reason, I voted present on final passage of House Resolution 296, the resolution affirming the United States record on the Armenian genocide. So there's a couple of things that I want to point out to. First of all, there's only one place in the world that there is not consensus, to use Ilhan Omar's words. The only place where that consensus doesn't exist is inside Turkey. As I stated before, the Turkish government continues to deny it to this day. They realize that it makes them look bad, and because of that, they say, no, it didn't happen. It did happen. And every historic academic in the world, except Turkey and the Middle East, says that yes, it absolutely happened. Turkey denying that this took place is no different than the Soviets or the former Soviets denying things like the Holodomor, where they systematically starved out 3 million people in the Ukraine. All the academics say that it happened. They affirm that it did. It's just the Soviet-style governments that go in and take out records, just like the Turks did when the Armenian genocide took place and it started coming to light. They started hiding everything, burning records, that kind of thing. And so the only academic consensus where that is not the case is actually in Turkey and other Muslim nations. Everywhere else they say, yep, absolutely happened. There is a broad consensus amongst academia of that in the historic community. And the second part of that is that really, if you switch this around, if Germany, for example, denied that the Holocaust happened, you have to admit it would be a little bit harder to take from Germany. Now, Germany's never done that. They've admitted to their mistakes of the past, and they've done well in doing so. But if Germany did exactly the same thing and every other country in the world said, no, the Holocaust happened, it was a real thing, would you really take the word of Germany that has a vested interest in pretending that it did not over the rest of the world? I would hope that you would be smart enough to say no, because Turkey honestly is no better than Holocaust deniers when they do this. And another thing that I would like to point out, where she's talking about we have to acknowledge all of the other horrible things that happened in the 20th century, the other genocides. By the way, even the word genocide comes from the Armenian genocide. That was the first genocide. It's literally where the word comes from. And Ilhan Omar is kind of subtly suggesting that it didn't happen and refusing to denounce it. But when it comes to this is as much of a red herring fallacy as you will ever find, where she's trying to justify something completely unconnected to the events that she starts talking about. Because when she says, well, you have to condemn all of the other bad things that happened in the 20th century. Well, first of all, you don't have to condemn every single bad thing to condemn one bad thing. Like, for example, if somebody steals something from a gas station, I don't have to say, you know what, that was a really dumb thing for him to steal that gas station. Also, the Holocaust was wrong. Like, you don't have to include every single bad thing that ever happened to condemn one specific bad thing. That's not how that works. You can condemn one bad thing in a vacuum without suggesting that you're not condemning the other things. That doesn't make any sense. And are we really to believe that Ilhan Omar would have voted in favor of this if it had included everything else? I doubt it. Because that's not really where the motivation seems to be coming from. But even if that were the case, even if it were the case that you did have to condemn all things at the same time whenever you condemn one specific instance of evil or genocide, even if that were true, Americans have denounced what's been done to the Native Americans. They have denounced the transatlantic slave trade many, many times over. We had a freaking civil war to undo the horrors that were perpetrated against people that became slaves. I mean, we literally had a revolution where we were bathed in blood and sacrifice to undo that wrong. We paid a heavy price for that, and should have. But it is impossible to find anybody in the mainstream now, and I believe this is a good thing, that doesn't condemn the transatlantic slave trade or the horrors that were perpetrated against the Native Americans. For example, what happened at Wounded Knee, that kind of thing. The Trail of Tears. I mean, I could go on and on here. You'd be hard-pressed to find any American that has done that, and Congress on multiple occasions has condemned that. And so she's holding a standard that's ridiculous and absurd, and it's a very clear dodge to try to put focus on other things, as opposed to the fact that she's not condemning a very clear genocide of Christians living in the Middle East. But even if that were the case, Congress has done that, and the average American citizen has done that. You'd be hard-pressed to find anybody that doesn't believe that those things were wrong in mainstream America today. Regardless of what state you were in, doesn't matter. And here's the other part of that. Do you notice that when she was talking about the horrors committed in the 20th century, it seems that she can only remember the ones that were perpetrated by America? Now, those were horrors, don't get me wrong. I'm not trying to make excuses for them. But I find it fascinating that Ilhan Omar can only remember the past sins of Americans. She doesn't mention, the Holodomor, the Holocaust, what happened under Pol Pot, Cuba, Venezuela. She can't remember any of those things. The only things that seem to come up into her memory are bad things that America did. Because at her core, Ilhan Omar despises this country. She hates it. And that comes through in everything that she does. I'll be the first one to admit that America's got problems. We've got flaws for sure. But as a country, we have been the greatest force for good in the 20th century and the 19th century. I think there's no denying that. Problems? Yeah. Have we always gotten it right? Absolutely not. But you can't compare what's happened there with the atrocities spanning the entire globe, and Ilhan Omar can't even think of one to use it as an example. The 20 million people that were killed by socialism under the former Soviet Union, the 11 million people that were slaughtered by the Holocaust. Yeah, you could go on and on and on. Why doesn't she want to mention those? Because one, they weren't perpetrated by Americans, and two, they make her side look bad. Because the vast majority of mass genocide that was committed under those circumstances were done by socialists. And so it really does put a light on where Ilhan Omar's priorities are. The truth is, Ilhan Omar cannot help herself. Because if she can't condemn the slaughter of millions of Christians at the hands of Muslims, then she's always going to side with the Muslims no matter what, no matter how indefensible that position may be. And you know what? She is a pure tribalist. She is always going to side with her tribe. Doesn't matter if the Muslims are very clearly completely in the wrong. She is always going to side with them. She doesn't care about right or wrong. She doesn't care about objective moral truth. It's all about what tribe you're in for her. And you know, these stories put together, I think, are a perfect summary of who the squad is. It's a perfect little microcosm, a lesson for somebody who didn't know who the squad was or what they were about. It's a perfect little lesson for who they are. Because with Rashida Tlaib saying that second graders should be running our country, Rashida Tlaib's just ridiculous. I mean, she's a crazy person. AOC is just clueless, has no idea what the heck's going on, which is true for her about 70% of the time. And I think that that's being a little generous and lowballing it. And then you have Ilhan Omar, who is a jihad apologist. I mean, that's pretty much what the three of them have always been. And then there's the other chick that nobody can remember who is not present in this, and therefore that's a pretty good summary of who she is too. All right, let's go to the Daily Dose of Stupid.
No, you messed it up. You're stupid.
Today's Daily Dose of Stupid does come to us via Australia. Now, for clarification, I'm not calling the entire country of Australia stupid, but this is a dumb thing that happened to take place within their borders. So Australia has banned, and this is Halloween themed, of course, a Halloween costume that was deemed unbelievably inappropriate. Those were the words that were used in this news story. And this came after a concerned parent complained and put together a petition with over 200 signatures. Wow. 200. I guarantee you, I could get 200 people to sign anything. I think that stupid, what is it? Dihydrogen monoxide. It's the fancy chemical name for water. That thing got like 5,000 signatures in a couple of days. I mean, idiots trying to outlaw water, which I found that hysterical. But regardless, 200 signatures, really? 200's nothing. I mean, absolutely nothing. I guarantee you, if you gave me a couple days, I could get 200 signatures on almost anything. In fact, that might be a fun experiment. I will see how many signatures I can get on a petition just to point that out. But regardless, so 200 people, 200 concerned parents, presumably, found this costume, quote, unbelievably inappropriate and thought that it should be removed from stores. So what is the costume? A bride. Not like a zombie bride, Not like a slutty bride, just like a bride. Just a, a little costume wedding gown with a little veil. That's it. Now, when I saw this the first time, I figured that what was going on is that their rationale was these were a bunch of crazy leftist feminists. And the reason that they were doing this is because it was some kind of stereotype or it was offensive to women and they shouldn't want to grow up to be brides and to marry somebody and they shouldn't put all their identity into a man or something like that. That's what I figured was going on. But it turns out I was wrong. And again, this kind of goes back to our last story. This is why you don't attribute motive until you actually know the motive. So their motivation actually was better. Granted, I still find this ridiculously unreasonable, but at least it's not coming from a place of complete craziness. There actually is a system of logic underneath this, even though their conclusion, I believe, is incorrect. Their reasoning may be insane, but it's not nearly as insane as the feminist message that I was kind of expecting to take place. So they're saying that the issue is that they're child brides. Now, I'm somebody that has personally raised money, personally donated money to the Mercury One Foundation and our Underground Railroad, which is dedicated specifically to ending child sex trafficking. We just did a segment at the beginning of this show talking about how our governor in the state of Alabama passed a law to allow for chemical castration of sex offenders who perpetrate crimes against children. So I'm all on board with this, and I understand the reason that this could be something that is a sensitive issue and should be. This is a issue that is near and dear to my own heart. However, I do not understand the idea that a little girl can't dress up and pretend to be a bride because there are people that will marry off a child because they're sick perverts. I mean, yeah, that's bad. Don't get me wrong. And that's 100% wrong, but I don't understand the connection. I'm pretty sure those people aren't the ones dressing up little girls in actual wedding dresses anyway. I mean, these tend to be the people that buy and sell people at marketplaces as opposed to doing that. There's probably not much pomp and circumstance and wedding ceremony involved in something like this. And I find it interesting that the phraseology used here is inappropriate. Because you're talking about inappropriate in a girl's Halloween costume. I've seen inappropriate in a woman's Halloween costume. I mean, any costume you can get, nurse, doctor, policeman, whatever, there's also a slutty version of it. I mean, this is a common running thing. It's not a secret. Just about any costume shop or online store that you can go to, it's one of the things that they advertise. This is not a secret. And yet I find it hilarious that this is the one that they see, oh, that's just too inappropriate. We can't go that far. I don't get it. I do not understand the rationale of these people. But here's the thing. The point of Halloween is dressing like something that you are not. Case in point. I didn't plan this, but it happens to be our Halloween episode, and I'm dressed like Deathstroke, so here you are. I'm not a middle-aged assassin that was trained by the League of Shadows and spends most of his time trying to kill Batman. That's not who I am. I'm not that guy. Or the Teen Titans, depending on, which version of the comics you happen to be reading at the time. Not who I am. I am actually pretty good with a katana, and I'm pretty good with a gun, but not because I'm a trained assassin that goes around killing people because I'm paid to do so. That's not who I am. I dress like this specifically because that's not who I am, because I wouldn't want to dress like myself. If I dressed like myself, I wouldn't be dressed up. I wouldn't be in costume if that were the case. That is exactly what's going on when little girls dress up as brides. They're not child brides. They're dressing as something that they are not. And that's what I believe that they're really missing the mark here, because that is really what Halloween is all about, is dressing like something that you like to be or you'd want to be, or just something that you think it's fun to dress up as. You're not dressing up as yourself. These people dressing up as their children, their little girls, as brides in these brides' costumes. They're not selling them off to men. The little girls just want to dress like a bride. That's all there is to it. You're reading way, way too much into this stuff. And I will say this as just kind of a tag along. It's a good thing that girls think about and fantasize about and desire to be married. I'm an unmarried person myself, and I probably never will get married. It's not because I'm against it or I hate the institution or anything like that. I just kind of feel like, especially at this point in my life, where I am right now, that God wants me to be single, at least for right now, and that's something that He will probably continue to do. If He changes His mind, I'm sure I'll be the first to know. But without getting, on the personal side of it, even despite that, it is a very good, wonderful thing that little girls dream about growing up and finding a man that will protect them the way Jesus Christ protects and loves the church, and will want to take their hand in marriage, and they start a family together. Little girls should want to grow up to be wives and moms, just like little boys should grow up and want to be dads and husbands. And part of that is wanting to go out and provide for their family. It's part of the reason that little boys dress up as firemen and doctors and police officers in various occupations. Not that girls don't do that too, but you know what I'm saying. One of the things that they fantasize about is growing up and having an occupation where they provide for their families. This is a good instinct and something that should be encouraged, not treated as though it's something dirty. And the fact that there are crazed perverts in this world that would sell off a child as a bride is a horrible reality. But it is not something that should ruin or taint a little girl's vision of what marriage is supposed to be like. And to take that away from them, I think, is in many ways letting evil people destroy that image and dictate the way that our children see themselves. I think ultimately, what this is a testament in, what this is a lesson for us in, is a lesson to mind our own business. If you think that it's a little too insensitive, that you don't want your kid dressing up as a bride because of that, I think that you're way uptight and reading way too much into that, but that's your decision. But there's a difference in doing that and trying to ruin it for everyone else and saying that nobody should be allowed to do that, that you shouldn't even have the option, that the thing should be taken off of the store shelves and you should never be allowed to do that. Why can't we all just mind our own business? If there are little girls that want to dress up like that and their parents are fine with it, I don't see the harm in it. And I don't see why that somehow harms you for somebody to make them that choice for themselves. Let's go to the chaplain's report.
In 1775, the Continental Congress created the Chaplain Corps. Under the command of General George Washington, each soldier was required to attend worship service every Sunday. While other armies advanced on their feet, Washington's troops advanced on their knees. It's time for the Chaplain's Report with Caleb Colquitt on tactics.
All right, Chaplain's Report today, and it is going to be a short one. I got to be honest, I never thought that I would be doing a Bible lesson dressed up as Deathstroke, but here we are. Halloween does some weird things to people, I guess. But no, we actually do have a really good Chaplain's Report today. One of my favorite verses. I really do love this one because it really does set the tone for the difference in those that have a godly worldview and those that do not. And I'm talking about something from the Book of Wisdom, Proverbs 9 through 10. So we'll go ahead and we will read that right now. Give instruction to a wise man, and he will be still wiser. Teach a righteous man, and he will increase his learning. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, and the knowledge of the Holy One is understanding. Now, the truth is, even though these are two very short verses, you could do literally whole lessons on these two passages. And it would not be difficult because there is so much packed into such a small space. First of all, it points out that those that are truly wise and those that are knowledgeable are the people that have a thirst for knowledge. Because if you look at it, if you give instruction to a wise man, he will be wiser. Which would imply what? That if you give instruction to a foolish man, he will not. And this is something that is pointed out actually in other places in the Proverbs, that foolish people are ones that don't want to hear new instruction. They don't want to hear ideas. And that when you correct them or say that they're doing something wrong, they either lash back at you or ignore you completely. You see, to be truly wise people, we have to be open to suggestion. And one of the suggestions we have to be most open to is that maybe we don't know everything and maybe we're wrong on some things. To be academically rigorous, we have to accept this. That we're all in development, that we're all in process, not a product. And that we're all still growing and trying to figure things out. That's what it means to be academically rigorous. And that's what it means, by the biblical definition, to be wise. And so in order to be wise, we have to constantly be looking for new information. And if we find instruction from people, the Bible says that wise people will be made wiser. And when we give instruction, because that's part of learning too, believe me, I learn a lot more when I teach a Bible class than I do when I am a part of a Bible class and am being taught by another person. When we are teaching another person, and we do need to do that from time to time, we need to recognize the wise from the foolish. That's not saying that we write people off and say, oh, that guy's not that smart, we shouldn't be teaching him. No, we teach everybody. But we need to be looking out for those wise people that will be able to use the instruction to its fullest and appreciate them for who they are. And if we teach those who are wise and teach those who are righteous, they will increase in their learning. And this brings me to verse 10, the second part of this. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, and the knowledge of the Holy One is understanding. You notice the distinction there? Because it's not uncommon in books of poetry to play the synonym game, where they basically, just for emphasis, restate exactly the same thing twice to sort of help get the idea across. And because it's done in poetic verse, this is something that shouldn't come as a surprise to us. I don't think that's what's going on here. I don't think that's what's going on here at all. Because if you'll notice in the first half of that verse, it says, fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. And then the second part, knowledge of the Holy One is understanding. You see, the difference is, one is the origin. And what is that origin? Fearing God. It's interesting that on this holiday where we, talk about things that make us afraid or try to even dress up as things that are scary, and I know that it's all typically done in good fun. Just like anything else, you can take it too far. But as a general rule, that's something that's done in good fun. There is such a thing as fear that is righteous. An awful lot of people say, well, when the Bible says fear, what it really means is respect. No, it means fear. And if you're not afraid of God, you're a fool. I'm sorry. There's no nicer way to sugarcoat that. A great way to describe it, I think, is when the children in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe first hear who Aslan is. And they just hear a little bit about him. And then someone asks, well, is he safe? And Mr. Beaver is kind of chuckling about this. He's like, no, he's not safe. Did you not just hear what I said? He's a lion. Lions are not safe. Well, that's also true of God. The end part of that passage is, but he is good. God is not safe. I mean, yes, he can be safety to those that believe in him and love him. The Bible often describes him as a refuge, a cleft in the rock that we can hide to, a strong tower. All of those things are true. But we also have to remember that God is also a God of wrath and vengeance and punishment. And there is a natural, healthy dose of fear that goes along with doing that. God has often been described as a father. Don't tell me you weren't afraid of your father. I'm still afraid of my father. I mean, I love him and I trust him and I know that he'd never do anything intentionally to hurt me, but I'm still afraid of him. There's still a rational and healthy dose of fear that goes into that relationship because he is my father, he is my parent. And I believe that anything that he would do would be to my betterment. He would be doing so to try to make me better. But just like when I was a little kid, I was afraid of him whooping me, or I was afraid of him taking away one of my favorite toys, or, punishing me in some other way. I'm still afraid of that aspect of God. I still trust him, I still love him, and I still know that any punishment he would delve out is done with the intention of making me better. But the point is that fear does not go away. And the Bible says that fear is the beginning of wisdom. And then the knowledge of the Holy One is understanding. See, the difference there is when we start coming to understanding and knowledge, that's the second level. That's the next step. Fear is where it all starts. Having that healthy fear that God is going to punish, that we are trying to escape our own sinful lifestyles, that's the beginning. But once our spirits have matured, it should go beyond that. Doesn't mean the fear isn't still there. That is still the beginning of wisdom. But we start coming to understand and know our parents. Isn't that exactly what it's like to be a little child? When you start out, you don't know your parents, and it's not your fault. It's not that you're not trying, but you can't really relate to them because you're a kid. You don't have a lot of life experience. You don't really see them as a real person yet. They're just a parent to you. When you start getting older, you start learning a little bit more about who they are, about their past. You start understanding why they do the things that they do. And because you have more knowledge, that trickles over into understanding of who they really are. It's the same thing with a Christian's journey. Sure, it usually starts out with a fear of God, but eventually that fear and wisdom gives way to knowledge of who God is, and with that knowledge comes understanding of why God is the way he is. We understand why he punishes. We understand why he rewards. We understand why he is able to love us enough, even while we were still sinners, to give his only Son to die on a cross to save us. And that is understanding. Stay the course, friends.
Tactics is a production of News Radio 1440 and Cumulus Media Montgomery. Any opinions expressed on this program are those of the host and do not necessarily reflect the opinions of Cumulus Media. The theme song for Tactics is 6 Foot Town by Big and Rich. Graphics by Jessica Dawson. Broadcast studios provided by Cumulus Media Montgomery. Location studios provided by the Dalraida Church of Christ. Copyright 20